On today's show, we have our guest, David Gola, and we're going to be talking about the Orthodox concept of Kenosis. What does it mean, and how is it different from other religions' concepts? It sounds familiar, it sounds similar to other religions, but it's uniquely different. David Gola.
Well, in the Christian East, we make use of, it was the Greek cultural world that gave us the earliest chapters in the history of the Christian tradition. And often the church fathers and spiritual mothers of the early church, they are, including, we see it in the Gospels and the apostolic period with Paul, they're using Greek language to try and say Hebrew things and to think through and respond to the question that we so often encounter in a variety of ways in the Gospels. Jesus Christ said on a number of occasions, "Who do you say that I am?" So Kenosis is the Greek word that means self-emptying, and it is thought of as very central to the meaning of the incarnation. That is, that God, the creator of the world, emptied himself and became human. Jesus Christ, as our tradition has understood it, is the fullest expression we have of God and the fullest expression we have of the human nature. So self-emptying, we see this in the gospel narrative, initially in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus Christ is in the midst of a struggle. He realizes that he's going to likely be arrested soon. And we have that remarkable time in the Garden of Gethsemane where he prays, he's wrestling with his mortality. He's wrestling with the fact that he maybe he's going to die. So in the end of that sort of prayer, that haunting prayer that we're given a glimpse of, he says, "But not my will, but thine be done." So to let go of your will so that you can apprehend reality in a clear way. Everything that's said about Jesus Christ is also a revelation about the human nature and our human personhood. So Kenosis also has a place in our understanding of the spiritual life. And it's a way of referring to that part of our spiritual life where we seek to let go, empty ourselves of our willful passions, our sufferings that have kind of colonized our way of seeing the world, and to, as Jesus Christ prays in Gethsemane, "Not my will, but thine be done." That is a way of saying, may I be free of the normal way I see the world, so that I can see the reality that God has created, so I can be open to my neighbor and to the other and see in them the image of God.
To empty oneself, so to empty one selfishness, but still be present to reality and still be present to the neighbor. We're emptying our selfish desires. Now, in Orthodoxy, do we still have a concept of self? In other religions, they deny there's a personal self, but in Orthodoxy, do we believe in a self? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a really interesting question because the whole biblical revelation and the heart of the teaching about the incarnation and what we see in Jesus Christ has two dimensions to it, as near as I can understand it. The one is that revelation is a revelation to restore to us, and the action of Jesus Christ, to restore to us the human nature as God created it. Now, it's not that the human nature had changed in some kind of profound and fundamental way. It's that we, as people with the human nature is shared with all of us human beings, but we become alienated from it. We separate ourselves from it, and we begin to imagine our nature and our being in our own terms. That's what selfishness means. That's what sin is all about. Sin is to miss the mark. Well, what's the mark? The mark is to be who you are, who God created you to be. So the first aspect of this is that the revelation of the incarnation is teaching us again that we are the image and likeness of God. That is the fundamental part of our nature as human beings. The second part of it is that you can become the likeness of God. The image, the human nature is the image of God. You can become the likeness. That is our personal and particular personhood. How nature takes flesh in us and how we live our own arete, our own logos out in the world. That's our personhood. And the teaching of our tradition, which is very rich on this, extremely rich on this, is that the human personhood can move towards, ever closer towards God. That it can become the likeness of God. That's what we mean when we say that we wish to become like Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean we want to replicate a man, the God-man, from 2,000 years ago. It means we want to become fully who God created us to be, both in our nature and in our personhood. It means, there's another Greek word, we are given the opportunity to cultivate, bring to fruition, incarnate our arete, the excellence that we are as an individual person in life. But that requires, back to kenosis, that requires letting go of who we think we are, letting go of all those dis-eases which are associated with memory and with imagination, with our ego, though all those ways in which we think we have to be something other than what we are and forget who we actually are. So the pathway the spiritual life lays out for us is the pathway to human personhood and the fullest expression, through the grace of the Holy Spirit, of who we are, both as part of the human nature, but also in terms of our particular personhood. You made a reference to Buddhism and the Buddhist teaching of no self. I believe that's where it comes from for you. This is a complicated matter. Buddhists have thought about this a lot. My sense is what we share with them around it is that part of the teaching about no self is really the same as the teaching about letting go of your selfishness. Letting go of thinking that your selfishness, your way of projecting yourself on the world, is what the world is. Well, that's your illusion. That's not the world. So I think there's some things that are shared there, and there's some good work to be done on the part of Eastern Christian thinkers and Buddhist thinkers around that spiritual pathway to both the disciplines for letting go and for losing one's selfishness, and coming to the fullness of your particular God-given excellence?
So we do, in Orthodox, we still have a concept of self, and yet you and I are very different people, and we still believe in individuality. But fundamentally, when we say to empty oneself, we're fundamentally saying empty oneself of our selfishness, but we still have our unique personality and personhood. We just do not force our will onto others or force our will onto the world. That's what is this the correct understanding of kenosis, is not to push my selfish will onto the world. Everybody should listen to the same music that I do. Everyone should dress like I do. That is forcing my will onto others. This is not the Orthodox way. I still have my individual self. You have your individual self. That person over there has their individual self. We just we empty ourselves of our selfish desire to project our will onto others.
That's the basic task I would argue it's the basic task of becoming a mature human being. And it is the center of the teaching about the disciplines of the spiritual life, is that of both recognizing that every human being is the image of God. That's a way of saying every human being is a wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And we should never presume about them. Because every time we presume about God, every time we make an image of God in our mind, that's a kind of blasphemy, and it's an idolatry. Well, that's an insight into what we do with each other. So don't do that with each other. So every human being is the image of God, and their personhood. I prefer the term personhood to individuality.
Okay.
Their personhood is both a calling forth of the fullness of the nature of being human, and the particular way in which that is manifest, because every human being is meant to be. You have come into the world in part because God wanted you to be. So kenosis is part of our coming to being. We must understand that our presumptions about who we are is not who we are. But we also are the carriers of a logos, of a particular word, which the world needs.
So fundamentally, we're all created in the image of God, but we're not our jobs.
Not at all. Because
we're not our jobs. We're not what our accomplishments are.
Right.
We're fundamentally built in the image of God. So even as we age and we might lose our ability to work, or we may become disabled and we're no longer the athlete, the attractive person, we're still fundamentally in the image of God, first and foremost. These other titles are insignificant. The fact I worked here for X number of years, the fact I accomplished this is irrelevant. I'm still fundamentally created in the image of God.
Well, I wouldn't say these things are irrelevant. Your initial point is absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Everyone is the image of God. But our personhood isn't and I think this is maybe what you're gesturing towards there, our personhood isn't our curriculum vitae. Our personhood is our drawing near to God, the fact that we, through the grace of God, can come to be attentive to reality. We can come into a relationship of communion. And it's that relationship of communion with the life of the world, because it's God's world. That coming into communion, that's the fullness of our personhood. So John Zazoulis, a great Orthodox thinker, has a wonderful book titled Being as Communion. Our being is the image of God. Our personhood can move to living a life of communion with the life of the world, with everyone we meet, including the stranger and including the other.
I'm going to make a summary. if you and I were to visit a monastery and we have there's a communion of people, we may be asked to do different jobs throughout our visit. We are still us. Everyone's made in the image of God. But even though our jobs may change, we're fundamentally the same. We are not our jobs. We are not our titles.
Our personhood exists. The likeness of God exists in communion. So where there is communion, there is both the image and likeness of God. Where there is not communion, the image of God is underneath, but the likeness has not appeared, has not been enfleshed. So it's not about what we do or what we think in our tradition. It is about whether we have awakened to the arising of communion in all of our acts, in all of our way of being in the world, in every moment in our life.